Please welcome to the stage Larry Platt, co-founder of the Philadelphia Citizen, with Jon Grinspan, author of The Age of Acrimony, and Ali Velshi, MSNBC chief correspondent and Citizen board member.
All right. Hello again. Welcome. Am I over here?
You're the boss.
I'll sit here.
All right, fine.
Welcome to the Hair Club for Men. The Hair Club for Growth, actually.
Selling razors here, aren't we?
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So this panel speaks directly to the political moment we find ourselves in. The bald man on my far left is Jon Grinspan. His book, Age of Acrimony, is amazing. It takes us back to the decades following the Civil War, and we learn that we have been here before. Everything you're feeling, it's not new. The polarization, political violence, election chicanery, and ultimately, most interestingly, the purposeful quieting of the electorate. So I wanted to have a conversation with author Jon Grinspan and the smartest bald man on television, and I am friends with Smirkanish, and he knows this. I tell him all the time, Ali Velshi. And because Ali, yeah. Ali is the most civically engaged, civic-minded patriot I know.
Thank you.
I even get choked up saying that because he's inspired the Citizen. He was one of the first people I talked to about the ideas for the Citizen 12 years ago. So I think, and he's been on the front lines of the culture war in the last 10 years. So let's begin, Jon, with setting the stage. Post-Civil War, Reconstruction, how bad does it get, and how close is it to what we've been going through these last 10 years?
Well, I wouldn't say that history ever repeats itself. So we're not going through the same thing they were. It's not working?
Is that mic on?
We'll give it a shot.
How are we doing?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. All right. So it's not the same as it was back then, second half of the 19th century, because it was far worse back then. We're talking about a level of political violence like nothing we've ever seen. A congressman was murdered on average in the second half of the 19th century once every 7 years. 3 of the 4 presidential assassinations in our history happened in a 36-year period. It's also at the same time the period of the highest turnout in American history. Eligible voters are going to the polls, 4 in 5 eligible voters, 80%, and those who can't vote are still women, children, African Americans in certain places, are still reading the newspapers, arguing the issues. There's a saturation of political life and an aggression and a polarization for half a century, basically. And then the amazing thing is it doesn't end in a civil war, it ends in people calming down somehow. And that's the mystery.
And Philadelphia was the epicenter of this. We had the murder of Octavius Cotto, which there's now a statue at City Hall, which you cover. And just tell me, I fell in love with your main protagonist, who I didn't know about. Does anyone here know about Pig Iron Kelly? No. William Pig Iron Kelly. We should have a statue or a mural. He was a congressman, a judge. Tell us more about him and his reform.
Yeah, there should be a statue like in Mancho in West Philly where he lived. The amazing thing about the 19th century is people had names like Pig Iron Kelly, and you get to write about them, and you can have an awful lot of fun with them. He was an abolitionist, a labor activist, a radical congressman for longer than anyone else was a congressman back then. He kind of lived from Jackson all the way through to the 1890s and is on the front end of every reform movement. He's also shot at, he's stabbed, he survives assassinations, he survives really rough elections, he survives the Civil War, he's good friends with Lincoln, and he raises a daughter to be engaged in politics in an entirely different way in the next generation. And by following this one Philadelphia family for 2 generations, you can really track how political engagement goes. This family, they both care about working people, but they do it in entirely different ways in the 1860s and in the 1910s.
And how did we get to quiet the electorate? Because what's fascinating, as you pointed out, is we had all this political violence in the streets. You had marching in the streets. Saloons were the political gathering place, and you had fighting and killing, and yet 80% turnout. 80% turnout. So, which sort of goes in the face of what I'm always preaching, right? Which is vast civic participation is a good thing. In this case, it led to disharmony. How did we solve for that?
It's not a one-word answer. It's a culture of politics built that era, and a new culture of politics unbuilt that era. A lot of the reform movements that emerged to kind of calm political culture, honestly, they look a little bit like the Philadelphia Citizen. They look like a local civic uplift organizations that try to get people to behave better, to calm down more. And it does take a bargain at the same time. We think that more people turn out, more people get engaged, the better things will get. You can imagine saying that to somebody in, say, 1992, when the turnout was the lowest it had been in the century. More people get engaged, things will just get better. We've seen turnout's way up since 1992, and it's not really better. So there is, in a weird way, a direct relationship between anger in politics, incivility in politics, and people participating. And some way we have to rebuild a culture of participating that isn't about beating the other side, that isn't about political violence, that isn't about kind of zero-sum mastery, I win, you lose. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a roadmap to doing that, but people have done it before, and that's the really important thing. It's not that we're in an unprecedented crisis and we're driving off the cliff. We're in a nation and a civilization that has had ups and downs, and we've managed to reform our institutions in the past.
And one of the ways that, because what you chart is the way that politics was able to get divorced from culture war. And one of the, you cover one of my heroes, who is Lincoln Steffens, the journalist who wrote Shame of the Cities in 1904 or 05. And that's where famously Philadelphia was called corrupt and contented. A line I've used often. There's also, I won't go off on my Lincoln stuff, but here's journalism sort of helping to calm the electorate by informing it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and steering those energies in other directions. So in 1880, 1870, political journalists got people fired up against the other party, and most newspapers are party organs, openly partisan. 95% of newspapers are openly partisan, and the front page is always angry, violent political news, and journalists often go shoot each other. Pulitzer, the highest award you can win in journalism, shot somebody. His executive editor shot somebody else. This is common. In the 20th century, the red meat is elsewhere. People start writing about scandal, Hollywood, celebrity, sex. They still have that same fired up, get the readers to pay attention, but it's not about government. And when you kind of mix up those energies and the control of the government, you really get an ugly cycle. You know, it's really different to devote those things to wanting the Eagles to win and wanting your party to win. Those are going in really different directions.
So, Ali, this all, I thought of you throughout reading
this is brilliant. This is amazing. There's so many points here that are so relevant to our day.
And talk about, I mean, and relevant to everything you stand for. I don't know if we've posted your last editorial on MSNBC.
The week after the election, the Saturday after the election.
It's totally in line with this.
Yeah, and so there are several things I want to pick up on that I think are fantastic. One is that real change, despite the fact that we live in 2024, and this is why I'm so devoted to the Philadelphia Citizen, real change doesn't happen in the spotlight. And my family history over 125 years in apartheid South Africa demonstrates that. It's just quiet work of change. And by the way, for most of my family's history under apartheid, they did that quiet work, and they were born, lived, and died without any change actually occurring, which was an experience in America under slavery. Didn't give up. Born, lived, and died wanting change, working toward change, and change didn't come. Came one day. Came later, built on the shoulders of those who were born, lived, and died. And that's the story of me, by the way, because my grandfather died in 1961 in apartheid South Africa. He had been Gandhi's youngest student on his ashram. He was 7 years old when he moved in to learn from Gandhi. Born, lived, and died in apartheid South Africa. at the height of apartheid in 1961, fully thought he had failed. Business was destroyed, taken by the government, and his son became a member of parliament in Canada, and his grandson is me. So it can work, number one. Doesn't happen in the spotlight, which is weird because a lot of people think it's got to be in the spotlight. Number two, I don't know that we have to move fully into, it's the digital age, so I don't know whether we have to move out of politics and into sex scandals, although this particular week, both of them are in exactly the same place. However, what we can do is we can engage, and I commit to this in part because of the work we do together, but in that essay that I delivered, I commit to the idea that citizenship and our focus on it as journalists it's not the same as politics, but it's in the realm. So for my viewer who tunes in on MSNBC to discuss politics, I'm still giving them we're still in the same realm, but I'm talking to them about citizenship. And fundamentally, the idea is you are exactly the same person you were 2 weeks ago. And the world's problems are very similar to what they were 2 weeks ago. They seem exaggerated, but they're actually the same problems. And the work that you were doing 2 weeks ago, with adaptations given the change in the political system, is still the same work. Right? You still have to fix the roads. You still have to run in elections. You still have to compete in elections. I as you know, lean into banned books. I have a banned book club in which I interview a banned book author. I'm still going to do that work. So I might be sad. I might be elated, but my work remains the same. And that's where I like the emphasis on citizenship as opposed to politics. Now, I have written in my book very, very clearly that while politicians give you lots of reason to have disdain for them in some cases, most don't. Most are the kind of people you talk to who are running for office because they want to change things. Disdain for politics is a luxury of people who have never had to live a day in their life without politics. Live for one day without politics. Live in apartheid South Africa. Be a black person before slavery was abolished in Canada. One day without politics, and you will clamor for it, and you will always want back in. So do not make that choice. You can hide under your bed for a few weeks if you're upset about the election results, but that's all you get. That's all you get. And to your point about voting, I happen to think voting is the price of admission and that you should engage and that we should have a 100% voter turnout rate. But I agree with you. It's just the price of admission. It's not actually the thing that says that you are a full citizen and a full participant in society. I think you should all vote all the time. I don't have time for people who didn't vote and who sat on their hands. I do have time for people who can explain to us why they voted a certain way, which is contrary to how I would have expected, and we're talking about the exit polls. There are some big surprises in this election, and I think we should study them all, but you gotta actually vote because people died for your right to vote, so you have to protect it.
I confessed to Ali earlier that I am unhealthily obsessed with the exit polls. I've just been, 45% of union households. Anyway, but John, go ahead. You were going to jump in.
I was going to say, and maybe this is the opposite of what you would say, don't pay too much attention to the nitty-gritty. This was a 2% popular win. The previous election was a 4% popular win. Before that, there was a 2% margin. This process of switching back and forth between the parties by tiny increments is exactly what happened in the 1880s, 1890s for 5 elections in a row. It's just throw the bums out, pick the new guy, throw the new guy out.
And a lot of bums were thrown out this year. Yeah. Around the world for the same reason that a pandemic came, inflation went up, and I don't like inflation, which I don't either, and throw the bums out.
Let me play devil's advocate, and this is probably my own psychosis this last 2 weeks, but I'm reading a vast political realignment here, and our second panel is going to get into this. The working class vote has become a multiracial working class vote has become Republican. And did blocks change like that? Or was it just anti-incumbency? Because this feels different to me. This feels almost like the Reagan realignment, where remember there were Reagan Democrats. And that has shocked me. Like I said, 45% union households, 54% of Latin men. I mean, you can tell I've been obsessing. This has not been healthy.
Yeah, they did. Certain blocks in the late 19th century, what happens is honestly, it's the wealthier upper middle class people who are deciding between the parties, and a few thousand of them in New York swing New York State, which is the California of the day, which swings power back and forth. All I'll say is this is the point when things seem the biggest. Remember 4 years ago, it seemed so consequential. Remember 4 years before that, it seemed so consequential. There's this writer for The Atlantic in 1894 who says, every 2 years one party is obliterated, and then 2 years later the other party is obliterated. So I'm not saying this isn't the beginning of some grand realignment, but it also might be the peak of a news cycle, and if you give it a little time, it will feel really different.
So I don't disagree with that at all. The distinction I would make is not, I wouldn't argue that it maybe is a massive shift. It is, it may be more to do with our misunderstanding of what's going on. In other words, the shift may exist in the newsrooms of this country and on the TV sets and on the editorial pages and on the newspapers of the country. We may be a little more of the problem, we meaning journalists and the media, because we thought things unfold this way and they unfolded in the election this way. You're right, not by huge margins, but shifts that are not logical to us, that didn't make sense. And the illogic of it is what I think is the problem, that we've misread. So even if the shifts are small, why didn't we have enough of a clue about some of those shifts? So I don't think it's a disagreement, but I just sort of see it differently, that what's going on that we should know about? What am I not doing in serving my viewers that I missed that?
I think that's what's been driving my search these last couple, because I really
looking for clues.
Right, and I do think that that journalists, if they're not introspective in this moment, do so at their peril. Right,
That's
you've
correct.
got to understand rather than condemn.
And introspection would be better than righteous indignation at the moment.
Yeah,
Righteous, it's free and it's in ample supply.
But there is, and I'm a historian, I don't know this, there is a Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump voter out there who can make things clear, but I don't know.
And if you want to add, and a Bernie Sanders voter. I mean, there's a weird amount of, and that's the thing that I think we don't sometimes understand, that happens in a lot more of America than we think it does. And little impulses here and there will shift that voter. But what has come out in early days of exit polling, and we'll have to study this more. I don't want too many hot takes right in the first couple weeks. But what is this idea of voters who feel they aren't heard by parties who think that they are messaging specifically for those voters? That's the interesting part. I mean, voters, I think, through all of history have probably said at various times, I don't feel heard, you don't see me, whatever the case is. All that's real. But when you actually think that your campaign's entirely about that, and those very people tell you, nuh-uh, that's interesting to me.
one of the things in your book, John, where the way that culture wars were taken out of politics, first of all, was the actual voting booth, making it private instead of this public spectacle where people fought. But also something you call educational campaigning, which did not exist before. It was brawling in the street, and it was about power. But now suddenly candidates were trying to educate voters, and I wonder if we need a return to educational campaigning instead of campaigning by political consultant. There's a sort of different problem on top of everything, which is the electorate saw some inauthenticity in their choices. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the story of educational campaigning is fascinating, uplifting, and depressing because politics in the 19th century is really exciting. You go to vote if you are allowed to vote, and there are challengers at the polls, partisan challengers who are intimidating you if you're not going to vote the right way. You physically take a piece of paper, a ballot, and put it in a box. Sometimes you are tricked into voting for the wrong party through disinformation and confusion. And then it's a really big civic event. People sing. It's a man's virgin vote is his first vote. It's his introduction. It's a culture. It's really loud and lively for those who are eligible to vote. They introduce educational campaigning. They introduce voting curtains, so you vote in quiet. They say more thinking, less shouting. The voters are better informed. They make stronger decisions that connect more to their ideology. They vote for all those progressive legislators who pass clean food and clean water. But turnout crashes by a third. You know, it's not as fun, it's not as exciting, and turnout crashes honestly among more vulnerable populations. Younger people, immigrants, African Americans are less likely to vote. So you kind of turn up one knob in culture and you turn down another, and they get better at creating an engaged citizenry, and a lot of that citizenry would rather watch a football game. So.
Right. And Ali, the question before the nation right now is, do you go back to 2016 and react in self-righteous resistance? What is the option? What are the options for people who are right now? And last night we had this almost therapy session after the movie Punch 9 for Harold Washington, with people feeling helpless and hopeless.
Yeah.
Even no matter who they voted for.
Yeah. Yes, correct. This is just a weird moment. I think I've gone back to have to read my own book a little bit to remind myself of the fact that people in my family...
Small acts of courage on sale here.
Knowing they did things knowing that the outcome would not be what they wanted it to be. But that they would plant a seed under whose shade someone would one day sit, whose fruit one day someone would eat, but they probably wouldn't. And that's what we have to do. There's a sense through social media, which I think is remarkably destructive, that results have to occur right now, that the work you're doing needs to result in something right now. The work you're doing, if it's good work, is good work. And frankly, I say good work is the work of citizenship and the work of civic engagement, regardless of who you support in a political party. Right? I will always give more credence to somebody who casts a ballot for somebody I don't like than someone who doesn't cast a ballot. So my point is that I don't, look, we all deal with these things differently. I cannot invest in righteous indignation, largely because I keep running into people in the street, including last night, people coming up to me saying, thank you so much for helping me get through this. It's like, I haven't helped anybody do anything. If I saw a journalist in the street, I'd probably kick them at the moment. But the point is, somebody thinks that we have a role to play here, and I'm not sure, and I'm sure there are some of my colleagues writ large in the journalistic community who feel that this is the moment for the greatest amount of righteous indignation that you've ever had. Not how I roll. I think that something is amiss in our politics. It's not there. Democracy depends on an informed electorate. I don't know whether when people make certain decisions, is that because they're not properly informed or is it because they're fully informed and they made that decision? That's what I'm trying to figure out. But clearly there's a role for me that's still developing and I'm still trying to figure it out. And it's all I think about these days. We have 5 times as many meetings in preparation for a show than we did a month ago, because I now have to say, are we giving people something that they actually can use and that they need? But I have taken righteous indignation off the list because I don't feel like it gets me anywhere. I'm seeing a lot of people, there's conspiracy theories developing, particularly on the left, about who didn't really win the election and how is it possible that there was a small shift in the entire country? It must have been rigged. No, maybe it's actually just a small shift in the entire country that we should be studying based on history. That's what I want to just go down this road between you and exit polls and data and you and history. I want to take these two and inform what comes next. There's always a next.
I love that. There's always a next. And which, at the risk of making you repeat yourself to this crowd, you learned as an 11-year-old.
Yes.
Can you just share that again?
Yeah, I was 11 years old. So my parents got out of South Africa, ultimately ended up in Canada. They were just in search of democracy and democratic participation. And because they couldn't vote because of the color of their skin, 10 years into being in Canada, my dad decides he's running for office, which was kind of ridiculous for an immigrant South Asian Muslim man to run for office in Canada. And people told him it was ridiculous. But he ran. And I was 11 years old, 1981. And it's election night, we've been campaigning, we go home to change. We head back to the campaign office at about 5 minutes to 8. 8 o'clock is when the polls close, but we figured it'll take hours to count the ballots. So my dad and I are in the car, turn on the radio, 8 o'clock, the announcer says, polls have closed, it's too early to tell who will form the government tonight, but we can declare in this particular constituency, the one that my dad was challenging, that the incumbent has been reelected. 30 seconds after 8 o'clock. We had just lost. It had the biggest, most resounding loss of that election. And I couldn't believe it. I said to my dad, I can't believe we lost. He smiles and looks at me and says, of course we lost. We were never going to win. And I said, what did we do this for? And he says, because we could. He said, because I could run and I could offer my position to people, and more people voted for the other guy than voted for me. That was actually what was going to happen the whole time. And now, life goes on, and no one gets arrested. Because he came from South Africa. If you did something on the other side of the government, you were definitely going to jail. And he thought he had done his bit. And he called and conceded his election within, a couple of minutes of getting to the office, which I thought was common. But that taught me, and the funny thing is, years later he did run and he broke a number of ceilings and was a lot of firsts. But I learned only from his loss about what politics and political engagement was. All those people, my dad and I walked into the campaign office, and of course everybody had realized it was going to be very awkward. Everybody had realized he had lost. And they were clapping and crying, and I'm thinking, what are you people crying and clapping about? He lost. Because they were politically engaged for the right reasons. They felt they had moved a needle that night, despite the fact that they had lost, because the work that they had done endures. And that's what we have to remember, right? The work that you have done endures. It doesn't go away because there was an election. The election's just a moment in time. It's just a moment in time. There will be many more elections. There will be many more opportunities. There will be many more tears, and there will be many more nights of jubilation. Your work has to endure.
I love that. By Age of Acrimony, we also have Jon's latest book, The Wide Awakes, which is also fascinating, on sale here. And learn about Pig Iron Kelly. I think he's our next mural in this city.
And bring back the crazy names.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Larry. Thank you.
That was great.